Panting heavily, the aging German shepherd dragged himself across the cold cabin floor, fighting every instinct to hide his pain. Instead, he collapsed against his owner's boots, his swollen belly hard as stone, silently begging him not to leave. Arthur froze. He had seen pain before, but never like this. The dog gagged, trying to vomit, but nothing came. Time was running out. Outside, the blizzard was closing in, sealing them off from the world. No help, no rescue. Then came the impossible truth. There was only one way to save him. Arthur's eyes fell on an old military needle, his hands beginning to shake. Because this time, the life he had to save wasn't just a comrade, it was family. The mountain stood buried under a relentless sheet of white, the wind whispering through frozen pines as snow pressed heavily against the lone cabin, isolating it from the world beyond. Arthur Hale stood by the door, one gloved hand resting on the cold iron handle, his breath slow and measured, the kind of control forged in places where panic meant death. He was a tall man, lean but solid, his frame hardened by years of carrying weight that was never just physical. His face bore the quiet marks of time, fine scars along his cheekbone, a faint line across his brow, and a thick, short beard now streaked with grey. His eyes, a muted steel blue, held a stillness that unsettled most people, not because they were empty, but because they had seen too much and learned to say nothing about it. Arthur was a man shaped by war, a former combat medic who had spent years stitching broken bodies together under fire, making decisions no one should have to make twice. He had left that life behind, or at least tried to, retreating into the isolation of Ironbark Ridge, where silence was easier to live with than memory. He expected a familiar sound behind him, the steady presence that had followed him through every quiet morning, but instead, something broke the rhythm of the cabin, a harsh, uneven breathing. Arthur's fingers tightened slightly on the handle before he turned. Ranger lay on the wooden floor, his large body twisted in a way that didn't belong to him. The German shepherd was 10 years old for a working dog, but still carried the dignity of something once formidable. His coat, a striking mix of silver and white, had begun to dull with age, but it still caught the dim light like frost under winter sun. His build remained powerful, his chest broad, his limbs thick with muscle earned through years of discipline and purpose. Ranger had not always been just a companion. He had been a military dog, trained for precision, for loyalty beyond reason, for missions that required both instinct and courage. Arthur had met him after both of them had already been worn down by different wars, two survivors stitched together by chance and something deeper than understanding. But now, that strength was unraveling. Ranger's sides heaved with effort, each breath shallow, strained, as if something inside him was pressing outward, crushing the rhythm of life itself. His ears, usually sharp and alert, trembled faintly, struggling to hold their form, and his eyes dark, intelligent, always watching, were locked onto Arthur, not with fear, with pleading. Arthur stepped forward slowly, his boots echoing softly against the floorboards. "Ranger." His voice was low, steady, but something beneath it shifted, something he hadn't felt in years. The dog tried to move. At first, it was barely noticeable. A twitch, a scrape of claws against wood, but then Ranger dragged himself forward, his body heavy, uncoordinated, fighting against something unseen. Every instinct in him should have driven him away, into some quiet corner where pain could be endured alone. hidden from the world, but he didn't go away. He came closer. Arthur's brow tightened, confusion rising, followed quickly by something colder. He dropped to one knee, just as Ranger reached him, the dog collapsing against his boots with a force that was weak but deliberate. It wasn't accidental. It wasn't clumsy. It was a message. Arthur steadied himself, his heart beginning to beat harder as he looked down. Ranger pressed his weight against him, as if anchoring him in place, refusing to let him move. A low, strained sound escaped the dog's throat. Not quite a whine, not quite a cry, but something deeper, a sound that carried meaning beyond pain. "Don't go," Arthur swallowed, the air in the cabin suddenly feeling too thin. He knelt fully now, his hands moving instinctively over Ranger's body, searching, assessing. Years of training surfaced without permission, his fingers pressing gently but firmly along the dog's abdomen. Then he felt it, hard, unnaturally hard. Arthur's breath caught. He slid his hand again, slower this time, confirming what his instincts had already begun to whisper. The abdomen was swollen, distended in a way that made the skin stretch tight over muscle, as if something inside was pushing outward with violent intent. "No," Arthur murmured, the words slipping out before he could stop it. Ranger gagged, suddenly, his neck extending forward, jaws parting as he tried to vomit. Nothing came. Only a hollow, dry, retching sound that echoed too loudly in the small cabin. His body convulsed slightly, then again, each attempt weaker but more desperate than the last. Arthur's chest tightened, a memory flashing through his mind, patients on stretchers, gasping, bodies betraying them from within. He had seen this before. Not here, not like this, but close enough. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows, snow striking the glass in sharp bursts. The storm was arriving faster than expected, closing in like something alive, something watching. Arthur barely noticed. All he could see was the dog in front of him. Ranger shifted again, lifting his head just enough for their eyes to meet. There was no panic in that gaze, no confusion, only trust. And something else. Urgency. Arthur exhaled slowly, forcing his thoughts into order, but something inside him had already changed. The simple plan he had formed minutes ago to leave, to drive down the mountain, felt distant now, irrelevant. Because whatever was happening inside Ranger, it wasn't waiting. And for the first time in a long while, Arthur felt something he thought he had buried with his past. Fear. Not for himself, but for the one life he could not afford to lose. He leaned closer, pressing his forehead gently against Ranger's, his voice dropping to a quiet promise. "I'm here." But even as he said it, he knew. Something inside his best friend was already trying to take him away. Arthur did not rise immediately after understanding the truth. He remained kneeling on the cold wooden floor, one hand resting against Ranger's heaving body, the other hanging uselessly at his side as if it no longer belonged to him. Outside, the storm had begun to take shape, wind tightening its grip around the cabin, snow striking the windows in erratic bursts like fingers tapping from another world. The mountain was closing in, sealing every path, every possibility, until only one remained. Arthur could feel it not just as a thought, but as something physical, something pressing against his ribs from the inside. He forced himself to move. His legs felt heavier than they should have as he stood, his gaze drifting briefly toward the door he had intended to walk through minutes ago. That simple act now felt absurd, almost cruel in its simplicity. Leaving was no longer an option. Not when Ranger had chosen to stay. Arthur reached for his phone, his fingers slower now, more deliberate. The signal flickered, unstable, but it held just long enough. When the call connected, the voice that answered was familiar, steady, grounded in a way Arthur desperately needed. "Arthur?" Dr. Susan Keller spoke with quiet authority. She was a woman shaped by years of necessity rather than comfort, her posture always upright, her movements efficient. In her late 40s, she carried a calm intensity in her green eyes, the kind that came from witnessing too many moments balanced on the edge of loss. Her dark hair, streaked lightly with gray, was always pulled back tightly, practical, leaving no room for distraction. She had grown up in rural Montana, inheriting not just her father's small veterinary practice, but his stubborn belief that no life, human or animal, was ever too small to fight for. It had made her resilient, but also honest, sometimes to the point of bluntness. Arthur spoke quickly, describing every detail: the swollen abdomen, the failed attempts to vomit, the way Ranger refused to leave him. There was a pause on the line, but it was not hesitation. It was calculation. "This is gastric torsion," she said finally, her voice tightening just slightly. "His stomach is filling with gas and twisting. Arthur, if the pressure isn't relieved soon, it will cut off blood flow. His organs will begin to die." Arthur closed his eyes briefly, letting the words settle. He had already known, but hearing it spoken made it real in a way instinct alone never could. "The roads?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "Gone," Susan replied. "The storm's moving faster than expected. No one is getting up there, and you're not getting down here." Silence stretched between them, heavy, unavoidable. "There's one thing you can do," she continued, quieter now, "but you need to listen carefully." Arthur's grip tightened around the phone. "You have to decompress the stomach. Use a large needle inserted into the abdomen to release the gas. It's not a cure, but it might buy him time." Arthur didn't respond immediately. His eyes shifted slowly across the room, landing on a small wooden chest pushed against the wall. Dust lined its edges, untouched for years. He knew what was inside without opening it. He had sealed that part of his life away with deliberate intent, as if distance alone could make it disappear. But some things never left. "I could hurt him," Arthur said, his voice low, almost lost beneath the sound of the wind. Susan didn't soften her answer. "You could, but if you don't, he will die." There it was again. Not fear, not doubt. Truth. Arthur ended the call without another word, the silence that followed heavier than before. He stood there for a long moment, staring at the chest, as if it might open on its own and make the decision for him. It didn't, so he walked toward it. Each step felt like crossing a line he had sworn never to cross again. When he knelt and lifted the lid, the familiar scent of sterile supplies met him instantly, sharp and clean, cutting through the cabin's warmth. Inside, everything was still perfectly arranged, just as he had left it: gauze, instruments, sealed packages untouched by time. Arthur reached in slowly, his hand hovering before selecting the largest needle. It was heavier than he remembered. He turned it over in his hand, the metal catching the dim light, and for a moment, the past returned in fragments, voices shouting, hands moving quickly, lives slipping away between seconds. Back then, he had acted without thinking, because thinking meant feeling, and feeling made it harder. Arthur exhaled slowly, forcing those memories back into whatever corner they had come from. This was not the past. This was Ranger. He returned to the dog's side, lowering himself carefully. Ranger's breathing had grown weaker, more uneven, his body no longer fighting as fiercely. Time was closing in. Arthur reached out, resting his hand against the dog's head, fingers brushing through the familiar fur. "Hey, stay with me," he murmured, his voice quieter now, more personal than it had ever been on any battlefield. Ranger's ear twitched faintly. It was enough. Arthur adjusted his grip on the needle, his hand trembling despite his effort to steady it. His training whispered instructions in the back of his mind: angles, pressure, precision, but they felt distant, almost irrelevant. Because this wasn't about skill, it was about courage. His hand lowered slowly toward Ranger's abdomen. For a brief moment, everything stopped. The wind, the fear, even his breath. And in that stillness, Arthur made his choice. Not as a soldier, not as a medic, but as something far more fragile and far more powerful. He refused to let go. The storm pressed harder against the cabin walls, wind rising into a relentless howl as snow swallowed the world outside, leaving only the dim, flickering light inside and the fragile breath of a life slipping away. Arthur knelt beside Ranger, the needle cold in his hand, heavier than anything he had ever carried into battle. His fingers trembled despite years of discipline, despite the countless lives he had once held together with steady hands under gunfire and chaos. Back then, hesitation meant death. Now, hesitation felt human. Ranger's body lay pressed against him, no longer fighting as fiercely. The swollen tension in his abdomen stretched the skin tight, unnatural, wrong. His breaths came shallow and uneven, each one thinner than the last. But his eyes, those dark, intelligent eyes, remained fixed on Arthur. Not afraid, waiting. Arthur swallowed hard, his throat dry, his chest tightening in a way that had nothing to do with the... He reached down with his free hand, brushing slowly along Ranger's fur, grounding himself in something real, something that still existed beyond fear. "I know," he murmured, his voice low, steady, though his heart pounded violently beneath it. "I know, partner." For a brief moment, his mind betrayed him. Flashes of the past surged forward, blood, shouting, hands moving fast over bodies that didn't always make it. He remembered the ones he couldn't save, the ones who looked at him the same way Ranger was looking at him now, trusting him until the end. Arthur clenched his jaw, forcing the memories back into the silence where they belonged. This was not the past. This was now. And this time, he would not fail. He shifted his position slightly, recalling the instructions with clinical precision. His fingers pressed again along Ranger's abdomen, locating the point, confirming what instinct had already told him. The pressure had worsened. Time was nearly gone. Outside, the wind slammed violently against the cabin, rattling the windows like something desperate to get in. Inside, everything slowed. Arthur exhaled slowly, deliberately, forcing his breathing into rhythm. Inhale, hold, release. The same rhythm he had used in war, the same rhythm he used now, to keep from breaking. His hand steadied, not completely, but enough. He positioned the needle carefully, his gaze locked, his focus narrowing until nothing else existed. Not the storm, not the past, not even himself. Only Ranger, only this moment. "Stay with me," Arthur whispered, leaning closer, his forehead brushing gently against the dog's. "Just a little longer." Ranger's ear twitched faintly at the sound of his voice. It was enough. Arthur tightened his grip. Then he pushed. The resistance was brief, a moment of hesitation between skin and steel, and then it gave way. Arthur froze. For one heartbeat, nothing happened. Then a sharp hiss cut through the silence. The sound was subtle, almost unnatural, like something long trapped, finally escaping. Arthur's eyes widened slightly. As he felt it beneath his hand, the pressure shifting, the rigid tension softening just enough to matter. Ranger's body jerked faintly, a weak breath escaping him, no longer strained, no longer desperate. Arthur didn't move. He held the needle steady, his entire body locked in place as he watched, listened, felt. Seconds passed, then more. Ranger's breathing began to change, still weak, still fragile, but no longer breaking. Arthur let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. His shoulders dropping slightly, the crushing weight inside his chest easing just enough to let something else in. Not relief, not yet, but hope. Carefully, he withdrew the needle, his hands still trembling, though now it came from something different, not fear, but release. He set it aside without looking, his attention returning instantly to Ranger. The dog lay still, exhausted beyond measure, his body no longer fighting every second. His chest rose and fell in a fragile rhythm, each breath quieter but steadier than before. Alive. Barely, but alive. Arthur lowered himself beside him, one hand resting gently against the thick fur, feeling the warmth still there, still real. "You're still here," he whispered. Outside, the storm raged louder, as if angered by what had just been taken from it. Arthur glanced briefly toward the door. He knew this wasn't over. The needle had bought them time, nothing more. Ranger still needed surgery, still needed more than Arthur alone could give. Arthur closed his eyes for a brief moment, gathering what strength remained. When he opened them again, something had changed. The fear was still there, but it no longer led. He reached for his coat, his movements sharper now, more certain. "We're getting you out of here," he said quietly. Ranger didn't move much, just a faint twitch of his ear. But it was enough to answer, enough to hold on. The mountain roared alive, wind tearing across the slopes as snow fell in blinding sheets, swallowing the narrow road and turning the descent into a path that existed only in memory. Arthur stepped out of the cabin with Ranger in his arms, the cold striking instantly, biting through layers as if testing his resolve. The dog's body felt heavier now, not from strength, but from the absence of it. Where there had once been tension, resistance, life, fighting back there, was now a fragile stillness. Ranger's head rested against Arthur's shoulder, his breath faint, warm against the collar of his coat, a small reminder that he was still here, still holding on. Arthur moved carefully, each step deliberate, his boots sinking into deep snow as the wind shoved against him from all sides. He didn't rush. He couldn't. One misstep here would cost more than time. It would cost everything. Headlights pierced the white void ahead. A truck engine rumbled unevenly as it pushed through the storm, tires struggling for grip before finally coming to a halt near the cabin path. The driver's door swung open, and Olin Carter stepped out, pulling his thick jacket tighter against the cold. He was a man built for endurance, broad-chested, solid, with hands that had known hard labor more than comfort. His beard was rough and uneven, streaked with gray, and his face carried the kind of permanent wear that came from years spent outdoors. Olin had always been known for his loud laugh, his easy jokes, and his habit of brushing off anything too serious. But the moment his eyes landed on Ranger, something inside him shifted. "What happened?" he called out, his voice cutting through the wind, though there was no humor left in it. Arthur didn't waste breath on explanation. "We need to get down the mountain, now." Olin's gaze lingered for half a second longer, long enough to understand that this wasn't a situation for questions. He nodded once, sharp and immediate, and moved to open the rear door of the truck. Arthur climbed in, cradling Ranger carefully across the back seat. The dog's body sagged against the worn leather, his limbs heavy. Arthur followed him in without hesitation, pulling the door shut as the storm slammed against the vehicle. "Hold on," Olin muttered as he shifted into gear. The truck lurched forward, tires spinning before catching just enough traction to move. The road ahead was barely visible, erased by snow and wind, but Olin leaned forward over the wheel, his usual careless posture replaced by rigid focus. His hands tightened around the steering wheel, jaw clenched, every movement deliberate. This was no longer a routine drive. This was survival. In the back seat, Arthur removed his coat and draped it over Ranger, then leaned down, pressing his body against the dog's side. He could feel the faint rhythm of Ranger's breathing, uneven, fragile, but present. His hand moved slowly along the thick fur, a steady, grounding motion. "I've got you," Arthur murmured, his voice low, steady, cutting through the chaos outside. "Just stay with me." Ranger's ear twitched faintly beneath the coat. Arthur closed his eyes briefly, letting that small response anchor him. Then he began to speak, not commands, not instructions, but memories. "You remember the lake?" he said quietly. "Summer heat. You wouldn't stay out of the water. Thought you were part fish." The truck jolted violently, sliding sideways before Olin corrected it with a sharp turn. Snow slammed against the windshield, visibility dropping to almost nothing. "Road's nearly gone," Olin muttered, his voice tight. "We're driving blind out here." Arthur didn't respond. He kept talking. "You hated the rain," he continued softly, his hand tightening slightly in Ranger's fur. "But you'd still sit by the door, waiting for me to come back." Ranger's breathing shifted, still weak, still shallow, but there was something steadier beneath it now, something holding on. Up front, Olin glanced at the rearview mirror, his expression changing as he watched the scene behind him. Arthur wasn't panicking, wasn't demanding speed or control. He was holding the line. "You think he'll make it?" Olin asked quietly. Arthur's hand paused for just a moment, then continued. "I don't know," he said honestly, "but I'm not letting him go." The truck pushed forward inch by inch, fighting the mountain with every turn of the wheel. Time stretched, each second heavier than the last. Outside, the storm raged without mercy. Inside, something quieter held its ground. Arthur leaned closer, his forehead resting gently against Ranger's head, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "You stayed with me," he said. "Now it's my turn." Ranger didn't move much, just a faint breath. But it was enough to keep going, enough to believe. And as the truck carved its uncertain path down the mountain, one truth settled deep within Arthur: the storm could take everything else, but it would not take him. The storm had passed, but the silence it left behind felt heavier than the wind that came before, pressing against the clinic walls as dawn slowly bled into the pale sky beyond the frosted windows. Arthur Hale had not moved from his seat. The plastic chair beneath him creaked faintly each time he shifted. But even that small discomfort had long since faded into nothing. Hours had passed, he knew that, but time no longer moved the way it used to. It stretched, slowed, folded in on itself, until there was only one thing left to measure it by. The steady line of breath, rising and falling behind the glass. Arthur sat forward, elbows resting on his knees, his large hands clasped together as if holding something fragile that could not be seen. The scars along his knuckles, thin, pale lines from a lifetime of work and war, caught the soft morning light, but his gaze never left the room beyond. Inside, Ranger lay motionless on the recovery bed. The silver and white German Shepherd looked smaller somehow, diminished not in form, but in presence. Tubes ran along his body, machines quietly tracking the fragile systems that had nearly failed him. His thick coat, once a symbol of strength, now lay still against his body, rising only slightly with each measured breath. But he was alive. That was enough. Arthur exhaled slowly, the sound barely audible, his body finally allowing itself to feel the weight it had been carrying since the moment the storm began. His eyes burned not from tears, but from exhaustion, from the long night spent standing guard without ever stepping into the room. He had been offered rest, a bed, a place to wait. He had refused all of it, because soldiers did not leave their post, and Ranger was his post. Footsteps approached quietly from behind. Dr. Kathy Reynolds stepped into the hallway, her presence calm, composed, though the faint shadows beneath her eyes spoke of a long night of her own. Up close, the fine lines at the corners of her eyes deepened slightly as she studied Arthur, not with pity, but with understanding. She had seen this before, not just in animals, but in the people who refused to leave them. "He's stable," she said softly. Arthur didn't turn immediately. The words took a moment to reach him, to settle into something real. "Stable," he repeated under his breath, as if testing the weight of it. Dr. Kathy nodded once. "The surgery went well. We were able to untwist the stomach and secure it, but she paused briefly, choosing her words carefully. "He's still weak. The next few hours are important." Arthur finally leaned back slightly, his shoulders loosening just enough to show the strain he had been holding. "He'll fight," he said quietly. "Not as a guess, not as hope, as fact." Dr. Kathy allowed herself the faintest hint of a smile. "I believe that." She turned to leave, giving him space not out of distance, but respect. The hallway fell silent again. Arthur leaned forward once more, his gaze returning to the glass, his hand lifting slightly before resting against it. The surface was cold beneath his palm, but he didn't pull away. "I'm still here," he murmured, his voice low, steady, the same voice that had carried through the storm, through the fear, through the long night. Inside the room, something shifted. At first, it was almost nothing, a slight movement beneath the blanket, a faint change in rhythm. Then slowly, carefully, Ranger's chest rose deeper than before. A breath. Not mechanical, not forced, real. Arthur's body stilled, every muscle tightening, as he leaned closer to the glass, his eyes narrowing slightly, searching. Then, Ranger's eyes opened, slowly. He didn't move much, didn't try to rise, didn't fight against the weight of recovery pressing him down. He only looked, and in that quiet, fragile moment, his gaze found exactly what it was searching for. Arthur. There was no confusion, no fear, only recognition and trust. Arthur's breath caught, his hand pressing more firmly against the glass, as something inside his chest finally gave way, Not breaking, but releasing. "You're all right," he whispered, though the words barely formed. Ranger blinked once, slowly, his body still weak, still recovering. Then, a faint movement. His tail shifted. Just once. A small, fragile thump against the bed. But it was enough. More than enough. Arthur let out a long breath, his shoulders finally dropping, the tension that had carried him through the storm dissolving into something quieter, something warmer. Outside, the first light of morning touched the snow-covered ground, turning the endless white into something softer, something almost gentle. Inside, 2 survivors remained. Not untouched, not unchanged, but still here. And sometimes, that was the only miracle that mattered. Sometimes, miracles don't come from the sky. They come from love that refuses to let go. Maybe God doesn't always change the storm. He sends someone to stand through it with us. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone you care about. Leave a comment and subscribe for more. May God bless you, protect you, and give you strength in every storm you face.